The arrest. It was a blistering afternoon in Pinewood City, with the sun beating down mercilessly, the heat radiating off the pavement as if the ground itself were on fire. The tall buildings that lined the downtown streets shimmered in the unrelenting heat, casting long, wavering shadows. The usually bustling streets of Pinewood had quieted slightly, the temperature keeping people indoors, in the cool comfort of air-conditioned spaces. Captain Angela Pierce stepped out of her black sedan, the sleek vehicle gleaming in the sunlight. The warmth of the day felt like an immediate weight on her shoulders as she adjusted her uniform. Despite the heat, her appearance was impeccable, her police captain's badge shining proudly on her chest, reflecting the harsh sunlight. She had earned every inch of respect that adorned her badge, and she wore it with dignity. Angela had spent over a decade of her life serving Pinewood City, dedicating herself to maintaining order and justice. She had earned her position not through favors or easy routes, but through relentless work, exceptional strategy, and a deep commitment to the people of her city. Now in her late 30s, Angela was one of the youngest black female captains in the force, and her reputation was one of resilience, respect, and unwavering dedication. But on this particular afternoon, after a grueling and tense meeting at the precinct, Angela was focused not on the cases she had to review, but on something much simpler: getting a quick snack. She walked towards the small family-owned corner store she frequented, a humble business nestled between a laundromat and a barber shop. It was the kind of place where the community felt like family, where the elderly cashier, Mrs. Jordan, knew everyone's name and often passed the time with light gossip. Angela appreciated the familiarity, the sense of normalcy that the store offered in the chaos of the city. As she entered, the bell above the door chimed softly, and a warm, familiar voice greeted her. "Captain Pierce, good to see you." Mrs. Jordan called out from behind the counter, her voice full of energy as always. Angela smiled, the sound of Mrs. Jordan's voice a balm for the stress she had been carrying all day. Same old, Mrs. Jordan," Angela replied, moving down the aisles of the store. "Just trying to keep the city in one piece." The elderly cashier chuckled, offering some local gossip about the neighborhood. But Angela's mind was already drifting back to the stack of paperwork waiting for her at the precinct. She walked toward the counter, her mind on the task ahead. But just as she neared the register, something about the atmosphere shifted. Angela could feel it before she even turned around. A cold presence, a shift in the energy of the room. She didn't need to look to know it was there. It was the kind of feeling that any seasoned officer, especially one who had faced prejudice more times than she could count, could sense in an instant. She didn't need to see the person. She knew the type immediately. A white officer, tall and stocky, stood at the entrance. His stance was rigid, arms crossed over his chest in an unwelcoming manner. His eyes were fixed on her, an intensity in his gaze that immediately put her on alert. It wasn't the curious look of a fellow officer. No, this was something else. This was the unmistakable gaze of someone who judged first and asked questions later. Someone who couldn't look past the color of her skin to see the woman and professional standing before him. Angela kept her face neutral, though she could feel the temperature of the room rise with tension. Her instincts were on high alert. She could sense the officer's scrutiny, and though she didn't know exactly what he was thinking, she knew exactly the kind of trouble he could cause. She tried to ignore him as she greeted Mrs. Jordan at the register, but the officer's eyes never left her. Mrs. Jordan, bless her heart, didn't pick up on the tension. She continued to chat cheerfully as she rang up Angela's water bottle and granola bar. But Angela felt it. The cold, suffocating presence of the officer, his eyes boring into her with judgment. Just as Mrs. Jordan handed back Angela's change, the officer's voice broke the fragile peace. "Ma'am, I need to see some ID," he said, his tone firm and unyielding. Angela froze. She could feel her heart sink, but she didn't let her composure falter. She turned slowly, meeting the officer's gaze with calm defiance. She had been stopped many times in her life. Just another day for a black woman in America. But this This was different. This wasn't just a random stop. This was a challenge, a deliberate attempt to undermine her. "Excuse me," Angela replied, her voice steady. The officer took a step closer, his posture aggressive, hand resting on the holster of his gun. His words were sharp and accusing, dripping with disdain. "I saw you acting suspiciously in the store. I need to see your ID." Angela's eyebrows furrowed, disbelief washing over her. Suspiciously. She had been standing in line, waiting to pay for a bottle of water and a snack. There was nothing suspicious about her behavior. She looked at the officer, a mix of frustration and anger rising within her, but she held her ground. She had dealt with men like him before. "I'm Captain Angela Pierce of the Pinewood City Police Department," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I don't need to show you my ID unless you have a legitimate reason to ask for it." The officer's face hardened, and his jaw clenched. "I saw you handling merchandise like you were going to steal something," he said, his voice rising. "I'm asking you again. Let me see your ID." Angela's patience was wearing thin, but she knew better than to escalate the situation. She had been through enough to know that a confrontation could be dangerous, especially with a man like him. Still, this wasn't just about her. This was about the principle of the matter. This was about the constant, silent battle for her dignity and humanity in a world that often saw her as less than. Taking a deep breath, Angela stepped forward, maintaining eye contact with the officer. "Officer, you're making a mistake. I've been in this store countless times. I'm not a thief. If you have any doubts, you can contact my precinct, and they'll confirm who I am." But her words only seemed to fuel his arrogance. He smirked, and before she could react, he reached for his handcuffs. "Oh, I know exactly who you are," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "And today, you're under arrest for suspected theft." Angela's blood ran cold. She had seen this before, officers abusing their power, using it to humiliate and control, but she had never imagined that she would be the one on the receiving end. The irony was not lost on her. She, a woman who had fought so hard to make it to this position, who had bulled and sacrificed for this city, was now being treated like a criminal. Her fists clenched behind her back as he stepped forward, locking the cold steel cuffs around her wrists. She could feel the weight of the metal biting into her skin, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to spin. "Turn around," the officer barked. Angela stood there for a moment, frozen in place, trying to steady her breath. But then she did as she had been told, raising her hands slowly, offering no resistance. She knew better than to fight back. She had to stay calm. She had to think. But the humiliation weighed heavy on her shoulders, crushing her under its weight. As the officer shoved her towards the door, she locked eyes with Mrs. Jordan, who stood behind the counter, horrified. There was a murmur from the small crowd of onlookers, but no one moved. The world outside had gone silent for her. She was just another black woman dragged through the streets of the city that had once been her home, now reduced to a spectacle. But she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning, the ride to the unknown. The squad car's interior was stifling, its air thick with the scent of sweat and stale coffee. Angela sat rigid in the back seat, her hands still cuffed behind her back, the metal biting into her skin with every shift of her posture. The heat from the afternoon sun seemed to penetrate every surface, even inside the car. The window was cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of fresh air, but it barely helped to cool her down. She couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of humiliation, not just for herself, but for the badge she wore and the city she had served for so many years. She stared straight ahead through the small, barred window, her mind swirling with thoughts and questions that felt too heavy to bear. How had this happened? How had an ordinary errand, a simple trip to the corner store, turned into a nightmare of public disgrace? The city she had vowed to protect had turned its back on her in the blink of an eye. Angela had always known that her journey in law enforcement would be fraught with challenges, especially as a black woman in a predominantly white male profession. She had faced prejudice in many forms, subtle microaggressions, dismissive remarks, and the occasional outright hostility. But she had always risen above it. She had worked harder, studied more, and fought for every inch of respect she had earned. She had worked tirelessly to be seen as just another officer, not a woman of color, but simply a competent, skilled, and dedicated professional. But this was different. This wasn't just a bad encounter with a rogue officer. This was an attack on her very identity as a leader, as a police officer, as a human being. She had fought for equality in a world that often saw her as lesser, and now, here she was, a black woman in handcuffs, being escorted by an officer who saw her not for her years of service, but for the color of her skin. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. The squad car jerked as it pulled away from the curb, the rough vibrations under her seat, a constant reminder that she was being transported somewhere she didn't know and certainly didn't want to go. The world outside was a blur as they drove past familiar landmarks, the library, the park, the precinct where she had spent countless hours working to protect Pinewood City. The officer, Stephen, hadn't said a word since he had placed her in the back of the car. She could only imagine the satisfaction he felt, the rush of power that came with humiliating someone like her. His silence spoke volumes, a smug arrogance that made her blood boil. But she wasn't going to let him win. She couldn't. Angela's thoughts drifted back to the events leading up to her arrest. The coldness in the officer's eyes, the way he had dismissed her authority with a simple wave of his hand. She had tried to de-escalate, to reason with him, but it had been clear from the start that he wasn't interested in the truth. He had already made up his mind about her, had already decided she was guilty before she even spoke a word. He saw a black woman, a police captain no less, and that was enough to convince him that she was out of place. In the silence of the car, Angela tried to push down the anger that was threatening to overtake her. She had been through much worse, had faced much bigger battles than this. This was just another fight, one she wasn't going to lose. The squad car made a sharp turn, jolting Angela to one side. She winced, her sore wrists aching from the cuffs. Officer Stevens glanced at her through the rearview mirror, the smirk still playing at the corners of his mouth. He hadn't said much, but his silence spoke volumes. He was enjoying this. He was enjoying watching her squirm, knowing full well that he had no real reason to arrest her. But to him, it didn't matter. He had the power, and that was all that counted. Angela's thoughts were interrupted as the squad car pulled into the precinct's parking lot. The bright lights of the station blazed under the night sky, casting a harsh glow over the scene. The car stopped abruptly, and for a moment, Angela sat in the darkness of the backseat, trying to steady her breathing. The weight of everything that had happened in the past few hours was finally hitting her. This wasn't just about her. It was about the systemic issues that had been ignored for so long. It was about the unchecked abuse of power, the racism that ran deep within the institution she had worked so hard to become a part of. As the door to the squad car swung open, Officer Stevens stood up and yanked Angela from the seat, his grip tight on her arm. She resisted the urge to fight him, to show him the anger that was bubbling up inside of her, but she knew that it would only make things worse. The crowd outside the precinct had already begun to gather, curious onlookers, civilians who had heard the news, and officers from the department who were just as shocked as she was to see one of their own in handcuffs. The flash of cameras greeted her as she was escorted into the station, the harsh lights blinding her for a moment. It felt surreal, being on the other side of the lens, the subject of public scrutiny instead of the one holding the camera. Angela walked with her head held high, refusing to let the embarrassment show. The eyes of the crowd burned into her back, but she kept her focus forward, her jaw set, her eyes cold with determination. As they neared the entrance, Lieutenant James Daniels, a longtime colleague and friend, stepped forward. His face was twisted in disbelief, his eyes wide with shock. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, pushing through the crowd to stand between Angela and Stevens. Stevens barely spared him a glance, his expression as smug as ever. "Caught your captain in the act of stealing," he said with a wave of his hand, taking her in for processing. Daniel's face flushed with anger. "You're out of your mind," he hissed, stepping closer to Stevens. "This is Captain Pierce. She's one of us. What kind of joke is this?" The crowd had grown, murmurs of confusion spreading like wildfire. Angela could feel the weight of their stares on her, the silent judgment hanging in the air. But there was a fire building inside her, something that she hadn't felt in years. The injustice of it all was too much. And now, in front of her fellow officers, in front of the city she had sworn to protect, she was being treated like a criminal, reduced to nothing more than a spectacle for the world to see. Stevens smirked, his grip tightening on Angela's arm as if to assert his control. "She was acting suspiciously," he said loudly for the crowd to hear, "handling merchandise like she was going to steal it." Angela couldn't stay silent anymore. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade, sharp and cold. "Lieutenant Daniels, let him finish. Let him dig his own grave." For the first time since this ordeal had started, Angela saw a flicker of uncertainty in Stevens' eyes. He wasn't prepared for her to fight back. He hadn't expected her to stand tall, to be unbroken. Daniels, who had served alongside Angela for years, turned to her, his expression softening with empathy. "I'll get this sorted, Captain," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "You won't have to deal with this much longer." But Angela knew that this wasn't just about clearing her name. This was about something much bigger, something that couldn't be ignored any longer. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant," Angela said, her voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. This is about every person who has ever been humiliated or mistreated simply because of the color of their skin. It's about exposing the systems that allow this to happen, time and time again." The crowd fell silent, hanging on her every word. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs too. Angela stood there, her heart pounding, the handcuffs still biting into her wrists. But this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. And when the reckoning came, Officer Stevens wouldn't be ready for it. The unraveling. The next few hours felt like an eternity to Captain Angela Pierce. Once inside the precinct, she was led to an interrogation room, its sterile walls and harsh fluorescent lighting, making her feel like a specimen under a microscope. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the quiet hum of the station's activities beyond the door only heightened her sense of isolation. As she sat in the chair, her hands still cuffed to the table, she struggled to keep her thoughts from spiraling. The cuffs were tight, digging into her skin, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional storm swirling inside her. She had always known that being a black woman in law enforcement would bring its share of challenges, but never had she expected something like this. A public arrest based on a flimsy accusation, a blatant disregard for her authority. In that moment, everything she had worked for, everything she had built, felt like it was slipping away. The weight of years spent climbing the ranks, fighting for respect, now seemed so fragile. Angela leaned back in the chair, closing her eyes for a moment, taking slow, measured breaths. She had fought so many battles, each one a testament to her resilience. This, though, was a battle she hadn't expected to face. Not like this. She wasn't just fighting for herself now. She was fighting for every person who had been unjustly treated, every officer who had been overlooked, every citizen who had been silenced. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was part of a larger pattern, one that was woven deeply into the fabric of law enforcement itself. And Angela knew that this time, she couldn't let it slide. The sound of footsteps approaching interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up just as the door swung open. Lieutenant Daniels stepped inside, his expression stern, his features tense with frustration. Behind him, Angela could see a few officers from the precinct, their eyes darting between her and the lieutenant, but they all kept their distance. No one wanted to be the first to speak, it seemed. They had all heard about what had happened, but no one knew quite how to react. After all, This wasn't just about Angela anymore. It was about something much bigger. "Captain," Daniels said quietly, stepping closer to her. He pulled up a chair and sat across from her, his gaze steady but full of empathy. "I've made the calls. I'm getting this sorted, but I need you to understand something. This is bigger than just Stevens." Angela met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I know," she said softly, her voice calm but laced with a quiet fury. "This isn't just about me. It's about everything that's wrong with this department." Daniels nodded, his face darkening. "Stevens has a history of this kind of behavior. I've seen the complaints, the reports, the murmurs from other officers who've had issues with him. But this," he shook his head, as if trying to grasp how far things had gone. "This crosses a line, and I'll be damned if I let him get away with it. We're taking this all the way up, Angela. I promise." Angela's thoughts swirled. She had known Stevens was trouble long before this incident. His arrogance and discriminatory behavior were no secret, even if his actions often went unchecked. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just a fellow officer making an offhand comment or passing over a slight. This was an intentional abuse of power, a direct challenge to her authority in front of the entire community. And what made it worse was that he wasn't just targeting her. He was targeting everything she had worked for. He was questioning her legitimacy, her humanity. As the moments stretched on, Angela's mind continued to churn with thoughts of what had transpired. The department, the city, even the public. The pressure was mounting from all directions. She had no illusions. Her name was already making headlines, and soon she would be a symbol of the very thing she had worked to eliminate: the systemic inequality within law enforcement. But this wasn't a battle she was going to back down from. She couldn't. "I want him gone, Daniels," Angela said firmly, her voice resolute. "Not just suspended, not just sent home on paid leave. I want him out of this department. He's a cancer, and if we don't cut him out now, he'll keep spreading, infecting everything he touches." Daniels nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. "I agree, and we will. But I need you to hold on a little longer. The chief is handling things, and once we have the paperwork and evidence, Stevens won't have a leg to stand on." Angela exhaled slowly, the pressure in her chest tightening. She wanted to trust Daniels. She knew she could, but there was something else gnawing at her, something she couldn't shake. The entire system was flawed. It was built on a foundation of power imbalances, racial tensions, and inequality. The public arrest was just one small symptom of a much larger issue that had been allowed to fester for far too long. "You think Stevens is the only one, don't you?" Angela asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think if we get rid of him, things will be different, but he's just one part of a much larger problem." Daniels looked at her with a furrowed brow, his expression softening. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Angela said, her eyes locking onto his, "that Stevens isn't just some rogue officer. He represents a mindset that's deeply ingrained in this department and in this city. There's a culture here, one that perpetuates prejudice, favoritism, and corruption. It's not just Stevens, Daniels. It's the entire system." For a moment, Daniels was silent, digesting her words. Angela could see the gears turning in his mind, but she could also see the reluctance. He had spent his career inside this system, and it was difficult to imagine a world without it, even if that world was broken. "I get it," Daniels said finally, his voice thick with understanding. "But what do we do? How do we fix it? How do we make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else?" Angela took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question settle over her. There were no easy answers. There were no quick fixes. She had spent years working within the system, and she had seen its flaws firsthand. The only way to fix it was to tear it down and rebuild it from the ground up, and that was a task too monumental for any one person to handle alone. "We start small," she said, her voice steady. "We start by holding people like Stevens accountable. We start by exposing the cracks and refusing to ignore them. And we make sure that the public knows that we, as officers, are standing up for what's right. This isn't just about my reputation. This is about restoring faith in the system, one case at a time. Daniels nodded slowly, his eyes locked onto hers with a newfound determination. "You're right," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We'll make this right, Angela. I'll make sure Stevens is held accountable. I'll make sure the truth gets out. But you have to promise me one thing." "What's that?" Angela asked. "That you don't back down. That you don't let this destroy you." Angela's lips curved into a slight smile. It wasn't a smile of happiness, but one of understanding. "I don't plan on backing down. This is just the beginning." The door to the interrogation room opened again, and Angela stood up, her back straight, her eyes never wavering from Daniel's gaze. "We've got work to do," she said, her voice quiet but full of purpose. As the two walked out into the hallway, Angela knew that the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. She wasn't going to let Stevens, or anyone like him, get away with this. Not on her watch. And if this was the spark that would ignite a larger movement, then so be it. Angela Pierce was ready for the fight. And this time, she wasn't alone. The tipping point. The days that followed Angela Pierce's wrongful arrest felt like they were stretched thin across an unending horizon. The internal investigation into Officer Stevens had officially begun, but Angela knew that the real work was just getting started. Her name had been plastered across every news outlet, a symbol of injustice and corruption in the police force, a symbol that was both empowering and suffocating. The public was watching, and the pressure was mounting from all directions. Angela had always been a woman of action. She didn't sit back, wait for things to unfold, or hope that someone else would take the lead. She had fought for everything she had, and this moment would be no different. But this time, the fight wasn't just about her. It was about the systemic rot that had existed for far too long within the very institution that she had spent her life serving. The precinct had become a strange place in the days after her arrest. The usual hum of activity had slowed to a quiet murmur, as if everyone were waiting for something to happen. Whispers followed her down the hallways, some supportive, some laced with doubt, but most seemed to be filled with apprehension. Many had turned their eyes to the leadership in the department, wondering whether they would finally stand up and address the toxic culture that allowed officers like Stevens to thrive unchecked. Angela was already on the phone, making calls to media outlets, community leaders, and fellow officers who had voiced their concerns over Stevens' behavior. She had a message to send, and she wasn't about to let the opportunity slip through her fingers. But the day-to-day operations of the precinct continued, whether or not the department's integrity was under fire. Calls for backup, paperwork to sign, investigations to lead. Angela pushed through it all with the same professionalism and focus she had always displayed. But the undercurrent of tension that ran through her every action was impossible to ignore. Her mind was consumed with the realization that if the department's culture didn't change, if the unspoken rules that allowed discrimination and racial bias to thrive weren't dismantled, then all the work she had done, all the battles she had fought, would have been for nothing. She was determined not just to clear her name, but to change the course of the department. She wasn't going to stop until Stevens paid for his actions, and until those in power were held accountable for enabling officers like him. She wouldn't allow herself to be another casualty in the cycle of injustice that had claimed so many before her. It was a late morning when Angela found herself in the precinct's conference room, sitting across from Chief Martin. He had called her in for a private meeting, and the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Though the chief was a man she respected, the atmosphere in the room was tense. The department was in crisis, and Angela could feel the weight of it in her bones. "Angela," Chief Martin began, his voice low and deliberate. He leaned forward, his graying hair and tired eyes betraying the toll that recent events had taken on him. "I know this has been hard on you. You didn't deserve what happened, and I won't make excuses for Stevens. But I also need you to understand something. The department is under a microscope right now. Every move we make is being watched. Angela nodded slowly, meeting his gaze. I know. I've been watching too. Martin sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I'm not blind to the issues we've had. And I know Stevens is the tip of the iceberg. But the last thing we need right now is a scandal that will tear this department apart. We need to control the narrative. If we let this spiral, it'll make everything worse for everyone. For you, for me, for the entire force. Angela's gaze hardened. You're more concerned about the optics than the truth. That's what got us here in the first place. Chief, you've swept problems like Stevens under the rug for too long. The chief looked taken aback, his eyes narrowing slightly. I'm not saying we don't hold Stevens accountable, but we have to be careful. If we go after him too aggressively, it could expose a whole bunch of things we aren't ready to deal with. People will ask questions about why he was allowed to stay in the department for so long. They'll want to know how deep this corruption runs. And that, Angela, will open a can of worms that we can't put back. Angela leaned forward, her voice steady, but laced with conviction. Then let it open. Let the worms crawl out and show everyone the truth. You think Stevens is the only one. There are officers like him all over this department. They just know how to hide it. You've let this fester for years, and now it's time to clean house. You can't keep hiding behind the walls of this precinct anymore. The chief was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. He knew she was right, but the weight of the situation was enormous. His eyes drifted to the window, as if searching for some form of clarity in the storm. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now, tinged with a weariness that reflected his years of service. I'm not disagreeing with you, Angela, but I can't just dismantle the department overnight. It'll tear us apart. We need a strategy, a way to approach this that won't destroy everything we've worked for. Angela stood up, her hands clasped behind her back. Then we start by exposing Stevens. He's not just a rogue officer. He's the face of what's wrong with this department. He's the one who's pushed people to the brink, who's made every officer of color, every officer who's not in the clique, feel like they don't belong. Martin met her gaze, and for the first time, Angela saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. It wasn't the kind of understanding she had hoped for, but it was a start. He wasn't willing to burn the entire system down yet, but he was beginning to see that change, no matter how difficult, was inevitable. Later that afternoon, Angela walked into the squad room to find a small crowd gathered around Lieutenant Daniels. He was talking with a few officers, but as she entered, they all fell silent, turning toward her. It was clear that word of her meeting with the chief had already spread, and Angela couldn't help but feel the weight of every eye on her. She could sense the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, but she refused to let it intimidate her. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about the officers who would come after her, who would walk the same path she had walked, and the next time they faced someone like Stevens, they wouldn't be silenced. They would fight back. Daniels gave her a brief nod as she approached. "Captain," he said, his voice low, "we've got more support now. People are starting to speak up, behind closed doors and in public. We're not alone in this." Angela felt a flicker of hope, but it was tempered by the reality that things weren't going to change overnight. The department had too many deep-rooted problems, and every victory would be hard-won. But it was a start, and it was enough to fuel her resolve. "I'm glad to hear that," Angela replied, her voice steady. "But we can't stop here. We need to make sure this investigation goes all the way. Stevens needs to be held accountable, and the rest of the department needs to see that we're serious about reform." She turned to face the officers in the room. "This isn't just about one man or one arrest. This is about everything we stand for as law enforcement officers. If we let this slide, if we let officers like Stevens get away with this kind of behavior, we're no better than the criminals we're supposed to be stopping. We need to clean house, starting with him." There was a pause, a moment of quiet before one of the officers, A young patrolman named Eric stepped forward. "Captain, we've got your back. We're with you." Angela looked at him, her eyes softening for a moment. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But this isn't going to be easy, and it's going to take more than just a few of us to make this right. We need everyone who cares about this city, who cares about doing things the right way, to stand up and be counted." The room was silent, but for the first time in a long time, Angela felt something she hadn't in a while. A spark of unity. There were officers who believed in her, in the work she had done, in the change she was trying to bring. And that spark, small though it may have been, was enough to ignite something much bigger. As she left the squad room, Angela knew that the battle was far from over. The road ahead would be long, and it would be fraught with challenges. But she had come too far to back down now. She would fight. She would stand her ground. And she would see this through, no matter what it took. The reckoning. The days bowled into each other in a haze of activity and pressure. Angela Pierce's arrest had sparked a firestorm, not just within the precinct, but throughout Pinewood City. News outlets across the city, and soon the state, covered the story, painting her as both a victim and a symbol of what was broken in law enforcement. She had become a figurehead, but she wasn't interested in the spotlight. What mattered to her was ensuring that this moment, this injustice, wasn't forgotten. This wasn't just about her. It was about the larger system of abuse that had been allowed to fester unchecked for far too long. Though she had been cleared of the baseless charges against her, the ramifications of the events that unfolded still hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Stevens had been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation, but Angela knew better than to believe that was the end of it. He wasn't the only problem. There were others in the department, some far more insidious, who still wore their badges with the same arrogance and disregard for the people they were meant to protect. Stevens was just a symptom. The disease ran deeper. But even as Angela prepared for the storm that was sure to come, she found herself caught in the midst of a fierce internal struggle. It wasn't just about fighting Stevens. It was about fighting the system itself, a system that had built walls around itself to protect those who held power, who abused it, and who believed themselves above reproach. And the system, as Angela quickly realized, wasn't going to fall quietly. The first sign of just how deep the rot ran came one afternoon when Angela was called into a meeting with Chief Martin. His office was quieter than usual, the thick curtains drawn, the harsh light of the fluorescent bulbs softened by the darkness outside. Martin was standing by the window, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes staring out into the distance. It was as if he were trying to collect his thoughts, to find a way to navigate the treacherous path they were now on. Angela took a deep breath, pushing the door open and stepping inside. She could feel the weight of his silence before he even spoke. "Angela," Martin said, his voice quiet, almost reluctant. He didn't turn to face her. "I need to tell you something." Angela had no idea what it was. She had been preparing herself for the fallout, bracing for the attacks from within the department. But this was different. Martin had been a mentor to her, someone she trusted implicitly, and yet she could feel something shifting between them, a quiet tension that she couldn't explain. "I've just had a conversation with the mayor," Martin continued, his voice low. "And it's not good." Angela frowned, stepping closer to the desk. "What do you mean, not good?" "The mayor's office is under pressure," Martin said, his voice tightening. "There's a lot of talk about the department, about what happened with you, about the arrest, about Stevens. People are demanding answers, but not just about him. They're looking at the department as a whole. They're starting to ask hard questions." Angela's heart sank. She knew exactly what this meant. The questions had already begun. People were looking for scapegoats, and soon they would turn their eyes toward the leadership of the department. Chief Martin was a good man, but the system he was part of was breaking, and she wasn't sure he was strong enough to weather the storm. "What are they saying?" Angela asked, her voice steady, despite the growing sense of unease in her chest. "The mayor is concerned about the fallout," Martin replied, turning slowly to face her, his expression grave. "He wants this to go away, Angela. He wants the department to keep functioning without disruption. And frankly, there's been talk about cutting some ties to make sure the media frenzy dies down." Angela's blood ran cold. "You mean Stevens?" "No," Martin said, his voice heavy. "I mean you." Angela's heart skipped a beat, the room suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. "What do you mean, cut ties?" "They're suggesting that you step down," Martin said, his words like a punch to the gut. "They think that if you resign, it'll quiet the media. It'll shift the focus away from the department and back to the cases we're supposed to be handling." Angela stood there for a moment, taking in what he said. The room felt like it was spinning, her mind racing as she processed the gravity of his words. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading but knew would come. The choice between sacrificing everything she had worked for and letting the department off the hook for its failures. It was a choice no one should have to make. "I won't do it," Angela said firmly, her voice unwavering. "I've spent over a decade in this department, and I've earned every inch of respect I've gotten. I won't walk away just so the city can pretend everything's fine. I'm not stepping down. And neither should you." Martin's face was tight with concern. "I'm trying to protect you, Angela. If you resign, it'll calm the storm. It'll make the heat go away." Angela shook her head, her eyes blazing with conviction. "I'm not the problem, Chief. The problem is a system that lets people like Stevens get away with what they've done. The problem is a culture of silence, of protecting each other instead of protecting the people we serve. If I step down, I'm complicit in that. And I'm not willing to let that happen." There was a long pause before Martin spoke again, his voice almost a whisper. "Then what do you propose we do?" Angela didn't hesitate. She had thought about this moment for days, and now that it had arrived, there was only one thing left to do: expose the truth. "I propose we take this all the way," she said, her voice low but filled with unshakable resolve. "We make sure that everyone who has been complicit in this, everyone who has allowed this culture to thrive, pays the price. And we start by holding Stevens accountable. We'll make sure that the public knows what's really going on in this department." Martin's eyes flickered with a mix of admiration and fear. He knew what Angela was asking for. He knew the stakes. And yet, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, he saw the fire in her eyes. He saw the leader that he had always respected, the one who had risen through the ranks with grace and dignity, the one who wouldn't let a system of corruption destroy everything she had worked for. "I'm with you," Martin said quietly, the weight of his words heavy in the room. "We'll go after Stevens. We'll expose everything. But you have to be prepared for what's coming. This isn't just about your career anymore. It's about the department. It's about the future of law enforcement in this city." Angela nodded. "I know, and I'm ready." The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, press conferences, and quiet whispers that filtered through the precinct like an invisible fog. Every step they took seemed to make the walls around them closer, but Angela didn't flinch. She had already made her decision, and now there was no turning back. She was going to see this through, no matter the cost. The internal investigation into Officer Stevens continued, but the pressure from the media and the public was relentless. Every news outlet was watching, every journalist waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. The city was torn between those who believed in Angela's innocence and those who saw her as a threat to the very fabric of law enforcement. But as the weeks wore on, Angela began to realize something. This wasn't just about one officer or one arrest. This was about something far greater, the reckoning that had been a long time coming. And as she stood at the precipice, ready to dive headfirst into the battle for change, she knew that the war wasn't over. It had just begun. The fall and rise. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Angela Pierce's office, casting long shadows across the floor. The news cycles had moved quickly, and the public's attention had shifted slightly, but the firestorm surrounding the arrest was far from over. If anything, it had grown more intense. Officer Stevens was no longer the only one under scrutiny. The walls of the department had begun to crumble, and the systemic rot that Angela had fought against for so long was finally being exposed. Angela sat at her desk, staring at the piles of paperwork in front of her. Though her mind wasn't on the reports or the ongoing investigations, she couldn't shake the feeling that every moment was leading to something bigger, something that would forever alter the course of her career, and perhaps the future of the police department itself. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Lieutenant Daniels. "We need to talk. Come to my office." Angela's stomach tightened. She had known that the wheels of change were turning, but the truth had always been more complicated than she had imagined. She stood, straightening her uniform as she made her way to Daniel's office. The air in Daniel's office felt thick with tension. He sat behind his desk, his hands clasped together, his brow furrowed. His gaze lifted as Angela stepped inside. And for a moment, there was a heavy silence. Angela could tell he had news, but she wasn't sure if it was good or bad. "Sit down, Captain," Daniel said, his voice quieter than usual. Angela sat across from him, her gaze steady. "What's going on?" Daniels hesitated, then slid a folder across the desk toward her. Angela picked it up and opened it. Inside were internal reports, handwritten notes, and a series of documents that made her heart drop into her stomach. These weren't just notes about Stevens. These were about her. "Daniels, what is this?" Angela asked, her voice shaking slightly. Daniels leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on her. "It's what we feared. There are rumors, Captain. Rumors that some people in the department are using your arrest as leverage. They want you gone. They want you to step down so that the investigation can be swept under the rug." Angela felt the weight of his words sink in. For all the progress they had made in exposing the corruption within the department, for all the time she had stood tall, she was now facing the very thing she had feared most, being forced out. It wasn't enough to challenge Stevens. It wasn't enough to confront the larger systemic issues. There were powerful people who wanted to protect their own, no matter the cost. "This is the plan they've been putting together?" Angela asked, her voice cold. Daniels nodded grimly. "The pressure's coming from the mayor's office. They think the only way to salvage the department's reputation is to make you disappear. They're talking about framing it as a necessary resignation, a way to restore order without triggering further controversy." Angela slammed the folder down on the desk, her fist clenched. "No, I didn't sacrifice everything I've worked for to be silenced. I won't go down without a fight." Daniel's eyes softened. "I'm with you, Angela. We all are. But this won't be easy. They have the mayor's office behind them. They're trying to push you into a corner, hoping you'll cave." Angela stood, her jaw tight with determination. "I'm not the one who should be in the corner, Daniels. It's time for them to face the consequences of their actions. I won't be a pawn in their game." The days that followed felt like a storm raging on the horizon, waiting to burst. Angela's every move was now under surveillance, and the weight of her position pressed on her like an invisible chain. There were whispers behind closed doors, and she could feel the eyes of her fellow officers on her every time she walked through the precinct. The question wasn't if Stevens would be fired. It was whether Angela would be forced to step down before the truth could come to light. But Angela refused to be intimidated. She knew she was at a crossroads, and she couldn't afford to falter now. This wasn't just about saving her career. It was about exposing the corruption that had festered for far too long. It was about the officers who had remained silent for years, too afraid to speak up, too fearful of the consequences. It was about the citizens who had placed their trust in the system, only to watch as it failed them time and time again. And so, Angela decided to take the fight to the very heart of the department. The boardroom, the offices of the men and women who held the power to either destroy her or rebuild the force from the ground up. It was a rainy afternoon when Angela walked into the mayor's office, flanked by Lieutenant Daniels and a handful of trusted officers. She was prepared for the worst. She had been summoned to a private meeting with the mayor and the city's legal team. The tension in the room was palpable as the mayor, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and a harder demeanor, sat behind his polished desk. Beside him were two attorneys, their expressions unreadable, and several other members of the city council. "Captain Pierce," the mayor said, his voice cool and measured, "we're glad you could join us today. Please, have a seat." Angela remained standing, her posture strong and unyielding. She wasn't here to play nice. She wasn't here to listen to platitudes. She had one goal: to make them listen. "I'll stand, thank you," Angela said, her voice clear and firm. "I'm not here for negotiations. I'm here to speak the truth." The mayor's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but he said nothing, waiting for Angela to continue. "This department has been broken for years," Angela began, her voice steady but filled with a quiet fire. "And I've spent the better part of my career trying to fix it. But what happened to me, what happened with Stevens, is just a symptom of the disease that's eaten away at this force. It's not just about one bad cop. It's about the culture that protects people like him. It's about the people in this room who've turned a blind eye to the truth because it's easier to protect your own than it is to do what's right." The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Angela pressed on. "You want me to step down," she continued. "You want me to resign so that you can silence this scandal. But let me make one thing clear. I will not be the scapegoat for a system that refuses to change. I will not walk away and let this department continue to operate in the dark. If you want me gone, you'll have to make me go. But I will not be part of the cover-up." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. The mayor's expression had darkened, but Angela could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone like her. But Angela knew that she had them on the ropes. They were scared, and that fear was the opening she needed. "We're not asking you to walk away, Captain," the mayor finally said, his voice quieter, though still filled with authority. "But you've made it clear that you won't go quietly. So let's figure out what needs to happen next." Angela stood tall, unwavering. "Next, we expose the truth. We hold every single person accountable. No more secrets. No more compromises. It's time for real change, not just lip service." For the first time in the meeting, Angela saw the mayor's mask slip, a flicker of vulnerability flashing across his face. The legal team beside him exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. Angela could feel the shift in the room, the sense that the power had finally started to move away from the city's established leadership and into her hands. "I'm not going to let this go, Mayor," Angela said, her voice firm. "I'm going to keep pushing until the department gets the reform it needs, and I'll fight until the end to make sure that Stevens, and everyone who enabled him, faces the consequences of their actions." The mayor looked at her for a long moment, his gaze heavy. Angela could feel the shift, the slow crumbling of the wall they had built around themselves. And with that, Angela knew the reckoning had truly begun. In the weeks that followed, the tide began to turn. The pressure from the media, the public, and the officers who had supported Angela mounted. Stevens was finally fired, but the process of reform had only just begun. Angela continued to stand tall, pushing for the changes that the department so desperately needed. She wasn't just a captain anymore. She was a symbol of the fight for justice, and she would not rest until the system that had wronged her was dismantled, piece by piece. The storm wasn't over. But Angela Pierce was no longer waiting for the world to change. She was making it change.